So this interview was not on my radar at all. This is an interview between PBD, Patrick Bet-David, and Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. And so I came across this interview, or I found out about it because I saw a thumbnail of Nick Fuentes reacting to the interview, I guess, or just reacting to the fact that PBD even did this interview, and so I knew that he was obviously criticizing it, and so I wanted to listen to the interview to see what exactly was happening and going on in this interview, because a lot of people came out, especially in the comment section, and they were just trashing PBD for even doing this interview, saying that it was a lot of propaganda and all of that stuff. And so I watched the whole interview, and I do want to get into all of the stuff that I noticed. Now, I don't have a whole lot of information or knowledge on the context of everything with Israel, the Middle East, and Iran, and also Gaza, but I thought that this was definitely a good opportunity to learn more. Now, I do want to add that I don't normally watch PBD's content. I am kind of familiar with him more so because of Vinny, who does go on Piers Morgan, his Uncensored show, and then also Adam. Some interviews I've seen with Adam, and he kind of annoys me, and so I do like that he is strong in a sense where Adam says crazy stuff and he'll kind of like check him and all of that stuff, but I don't know how he is one-on-one with his guests, kind of I guess the bigger picture of what he stands for, what his values are, where he is on the different issues and all of that stuff. And so this was a good opportunity, one, to actually hear Benjamin Netanyahu in his own words, but then also kind of learn more about PBD and how he approaches interviews and all of that stuff. And so going into this interview, I knew that people either like Benjamin Netanyahu, they're pro-Israel, or they absolutely hate him. They think he is a dictator, he is a person who is committing genocide, and he's using the American government, the American people, American money to finance everything that he is doing to the people in Gaza. So I already had some biases coming into this interview, but I did want to give it a fair shot, and these are my observations. This is Hey Britney. Welcome back. Okay, so what are my overall thoughts of this interview? This was surprisingly very short. It was just 41 minutes, and I've been watching other interviews where they're like an hour long, 2 hours, almost 3 hours, that sort of thing. So I would have expected a much longer conversation given who Benjamin Netanyahu is, what he represents right now. So this should have been a longer conversation to really kind of have that back and forth conversation, discussion, debate about the different topics regarding Israel. And I do agree with a lot of people that there's not really any pushback. I can only think of 2 times where he pushed back. The first time was when he wanted him to clarify whether or not he thought that Trump would have stopped this war had he been in power, and he would have prevented Hamas from attacking Israel. And then the second was when he was pressing Netanyahu on the Armenian genocide and really hitting home like, no, you, the prime minister, you have not acknowledged the genocide and all of that stuff. And so those are the only 2 times I can think of where he pushed back or tried to ask follow-up questions or make follow-up statements to get a clear answer. But aside from that, he did just ask questions. He asked direct questions, but there wasn't a whole lot of, I guess, dialogue about the answers once they were given. It was just, here's the question, answer it, we're going to move on to the next question. And so I really felt like the vibes of this interview were like how a celebrity or an actor would go on a press tour to promote their new book, their new movie, whatever, and in those press tours, they're getting softball questions. They're really just given an opportunity to positively talk about whatever it is they're promoting. And so this interview really felt like that. I just felt like there were no right or wrong answers. Whatever answer was given was obviously given with that kind of perspective in mind, where this is to present Israel in the best light. And so I did get that vibe from the interview, just from the way the questions were asked and then the way that the answers were given. And let's talk about the questions. So the questions were direct, and they were calling out or challenging certain narratives about Netanyahu and Israel, but the questions were kind of framed in a way where it made any opposition to Netanyahu seem like it was up for debate. Like, so if some people believe that he is a dictator, he is committing a genocide, and so this is kind of presented as a narrative that's not true versus being presented as something that is arguably true, and he should have to more directly address those comments or those opinions without being able to spin it in the way that he did. So I thought that that was interesting, just how the questions were framed, because I just got the sense that he was there to basically prove why other people are wrong without speaking to, hey, yes, this is what people are thinking about me and I need to do X, Y, and Z in order to correct that narrative. Like, I need to atone for why people think that of me. It was just more of a reinforcement, or kind of like a doubling down of, people think this about me, but no, I'm just protecting my country and I'm not actually whatever label you're trying to assign to me or whatever. So that's kind of just in a roundabout way how I feel like this interview was. And then also, when it came time to give his answers, he did a good job of answering the question, but doing so in a way that framed Israel in a good light, but then also making you lose sight of what the question was, because there was a few times where I was like, hey, what was the question that was asked? And I had to go back and actually listen to see what the question was and then kind of re-examine the answer with that in mind. So there was one situation where I was able to kind of better understand it once I replayed it a few times, but I did feel like the answers were kind of pushing away from the question and moving away from the question and redirecting it to something else that was a little bit more positive while still kind of somewhat adjusting the question. And then I noticed in terms of body language, PBD, he seemed a little bit annoyed at times, or he just had a energy about him or a look on his face when Netanyahu was talking at times where it seemed like he was either annoyed or frustrated or not expecting this long-winded answer. And so I thought it was funny because once I made that kind of observation of his body language, the camera panned away from him, and I didn't know if they picked up on the fact hey, he looks annoyed, or I don't think he looked bored, but he just looked off-put by whatever was being said. And so I noticed that. And then I also noticed that I couldn't tell if he was reacting to one long-winded answers that didn't always address the question being asked. And then I also didn't know if he could only hear Netanyahu, but he couldn't physically see him on the screen. And so that was why he also kind of had different body language, because when you can see someone talking in front of you, you might respond a little bit differently when you can see them on the screen and you know that they can see you, versus if you're just hearing them and they're hearing you and you guys are not physically seeing each other. So I thought that his body language at times was a little bit off from what we were hearing. And I also, after watching the full interview, I felt like the title was a little misleading, because the title is Benjamin Netanyahu Admits Genocide, Slammed AIPAC Critics, and Trump Owning Gaza. And so I felt like the genocide part was a little bit clickbaity, because obviously he's not talking about Gaza, he's talking about the Armenian genocide. And so if you are expecting him to kind of admit to Gaza being a genocide, that's obviously not happening in this interview. Now, getting into the thumbnail of Nick's comments on this interview, I was watching a kind of reaction video of Iron Descent, and basically they were playing Nick's content and reacting to it, and I thought it was a good video to watch because they were adding some more historical context to what Nick was saying. And basically Nick was saying that he doesn't understand why PBD would do an interview with Netanyahu but not him, and then the whole thing with him saying the N-word and not sure if he's going to be respectful in the interview, and then how he handled the reaction on his own shows to other shows. And so I can see where PBD is coming from. Basically, he doesn't know if it's worth the headache to have Nick on his show, in terms of having to deal with actually interacting with Nick, how his audience is going to react, and then what Nick may do after. And so I can understand why he wouldn't want to have Nick on his show, but I do think it is a weird thing to have this one person who has a horrible label and this other person who also kind of had a controversial label, and give one an opportunity and not the other. But I also feel like it's kind of two completely different things. Like Nick was saying, yes, this is the world leader, so obviously you want to platform him, but why would you platform him in this way to where you don't push back on anything that he says at all? Because obviously this was just kind of like a PR interview where you're just giving somebody more exposure. It wasn't a discussion, it wasn't a debate or anything like that. And so I think that's why a lot of people are having problems with this interview. Okay, so getting into the interview, they talked about why Netanyahu was doing this interview, and he said that he basically heard that PBD wanted to have him on his show, and then he also wants to come out and combat the PR narrative about him and Israel. So basically, he wants to counteract any negative publicity, social media comments, and all of that stuff about Israel and what they are doing in Gaza. And so I would be curious to know who he's talking about. Who did you hear from that PBD wanted to do this this interview, who is the person who set this up, and then all of that good stuff, because I think that helps to understand how this interview even happened, because a lot of people are saying, why would PBD do this interview? He's not knowledgeable enough, whatever. Other people are saying there's other intentions. I don't really know any of the backstory of that, but I was expecting, I guess, more of like a 60 minutes interview where there's a lot of hard questions, there's a lot of follow-up questions, and really making that person kind of work for it and really earn any good PR from that interview, because yes, you're supposed to get more exposure, but you also want to hold them to the fire and make sure that no stone is unturned. And so Netanyahu is honest, and he says that his other goal is to change the face of the Middle East. He wants to ensure that they are safe from any enemies who are threatening their livelihoods and their right to exist. And they also talk about the Gaza war. I'm assuming they're talking about the Gaza war and why it's taking so long to end that war. So I'm going to play a clip from the interview.
So it was clear to me that we had to topple the Iran axis and not just deal with Hamas. And what happened following that was that we went in, Hamas is in its last breath. We haven't finished it yet, but we crippled Hamas. Then we went and finished off Hezbollah, took out Nasrallah. That led to the collapse of the Assad regime, whose armaments we destroyed. The Syrian army's armaments. We dealt with the Houthis, still dealing with them. And then we had Iran itself that had struck us, and we had to strike back. And as you see, we changed the face of the Middle East.
Okay, so in that clip, he's basically talking about how they had to retaliate, and then obviously there's the question of whether or not they allowed October 7th to happen, which would give them a reason to retaliate in the manner that they have. And then I thought that this was a leading statement, or he kind of opened the door for this question, because he was talking about how basically you want to get the war over as quickly as possible, and you don't want to take a whole lot of time. And so PBD asked, like, hey, why is this taking longer than it's taking? And I thought that was a weird way to say it, because there's no kind of like timeline set on how long this war should have actually taken if we're talking about retaliating or acting in self-defense. Like, you can't act in self-defense forever. So what is the appropriate timeline as far as enacting self-defense? And so basically he was saying that I guess all of this is connected to the Iran axis, but I didn't really understand this when I first heard this interview the first time, because I was like, hey, the question is about Gaza, so why are you talking about Iran? And so basically it seems like he is saying, hey, we reacted to what Hamas did to us, so this is why we reacted to Gaza the way that we have, but then also this is just a green light to go after the other enemies, is how it sounds like he's wording this, because he's basically saying, Hamas is going to attack us, these other terrorist groups are going to attack us, so we need to take care of all of these different things at once. And so that's why it's taking a long time, because I think at this point it's been almost 2 years of this happening, and so it just sounds like a really long time to enact self-defense. Like, once you, like, say for example, to give an analogy, you get in a fight, somebody jumps you from behind, at that point you have the right to defend yourself, but at what point are you no longer defending yourself and you are the person who is attacking somebody else and they are defenseless? And so I think that those are all good questions that everyone is asking. And so I was just confused at this part of the interview, why he gave this particular answer, because it didn't really address what was going on with Gaza. It was just kind of like a blanket explanation for everything that is happening as it relates to Israel and its enemies. Okay, moving on, PBD brought up Netanyahu being banned, and then also the ICC. So Netanyahu is banned in 124 countries, so if he goes to those countries, he can be arrested. And then he also talked about how Churchill had this reputation too, when they were fighting the German Axis and just wanting to prevent the danger to the West. And then he also is really hitting home, like, hey, you can't sleep when someone is hunting you. You always have to be on the defense or you're going to be taken out. And so he's setting up this narrative that, hey, we have to watch our backs 24/7. We can't rest. This is why we can't let up. This is why the war is going on for so long. And so I think that is kind of reinforcing the idea of why they have to go to the extreme that they are going to. So this is the idea of a never-ending fight. And then also it came up where Netanyahu is basically saying, well, the UN, this is comprised of 180, 190 countries. They think the earth is flat. So they are basically believing things that are not true. So whatever they're saying about me is not true by extension. And so I didn't know if this was a fair argument, because I know there's a bunch of people who think that the earth is flat. There's people who don't think that the earth is flat and all of that stuff. And so I think it was just kind of like a kind of unnecessary side conversation that didn't really focus on the issues that were being talked about in this interview as it relates to Israel and the war that it is fighting. Now, in relation to the ICC case against Benjamin Netanyahu, there's the argument that these crimes he's being charged with these different crimes, but he's drawing out the war to prevent that case from moving forward. And so he brought up how with the ICC, there is a guy, Khan. He's no longer, I guess, overseeing the case, but basically he was saying that guy was saying that there's no problems in Israel. They have like a legal system set up, whatever. And then he was supposed to come, I guess, for an interview or something like that. He canceled at the last minute. And then days later, he issued a charge of war crimes against Benjamin Netanyahu and somebody else. And then he was saying that all of this was basically to help Khan get out of legal trouble because he was being accused of certain crimes, and then as a result of that, he had to basically charge Netanyahu with these war crimes. So he's basically saying that this is a corrupt government body that is just making up charges against him. And so I was watching Nick's reaction to this interview, and he was basically saying that there are countries that are pro-Israel that recognize the rulings of the ICC and what they are charging both Netanyahu and Hamas with as far as war crimes. So he's saying they're not just going after you, Netanyahu, they're also going after Hamas. So you can't say that these are corrupt charges or these are illegitimate charges, because they're charging both sides of the issue with the same crime. And so I think in that sense, there's pushback on him saying that the ICC is corrupt and that these charges were just brought against him to help somebody else get out of trouble, like it was their get out of jail free moment in order to drop charges against them by going after Netanyahu. Now, I did want to fact check something that he said about the ICC, and basically the U.S. is not part of it. And what I read online is that it's basically saying that the ICC, what they're trying to do is not in line with the U.S. Constitution, and it's considered government overreach regarding American citizens. And so that's why we are not part of the ICC. And the whole idea is that if we are part of this, I guess, the U.S. soldiers could be charged for crimes that they commit on U.S. soil, and that's not something that we want to happen. We want to uphold our constitution, so that's why we're not part of ICC, but there are other countries who legitimize the rulings of this organization. Moving on, they talk about Israel's ability to afford the war and then also the right to defend itself. So I want to play a clip on them talking about Israel's economy.
So our economy is actually doing quite well, I should say. And it's amazing. And you're right to ask it. But there was an economic miracle in Israel, which I'm very proud to have led. And we just have this resilient capacity, both in our economy, but also in our fighting spirit. We've gone through the Holocaust, and I'm committed, as are my people, to prevent a second Holocaust that Iran was planning. And that's what we've been doing in this war. It's taken this long because we had to break this noose of death that Iran was going to put on us in their plans to conquer the Middle East, in their plans to then proceed to Europe, and in their plans to then proceed to America. They say death to America. We're just standing in their way. And boy, did we stand in their way.
So this part of the interview, Sabby Sabs brought this up in her video, and she was really questioning PBD for bringing up money and the economy, and he was just really talking about the financial aspects of the war instead of like the human lives that are being lost. However, I do think that is a good point that she's making. Like, you should be talking about the human lives and all of the damage and destruction that is being done to the people of Gaza as a result of this war and this prolonged war against people who are defenseless. And then also, I think it is good to talk about the financial finances because he's basically talking about how great the economy is. So PBD was talking about the debt to GDP ratio, and I think at first it was 60% and it's gone up to 75%. So basically, this has to do with the ability to repay loans. So you want your economy to be doing well. And so they talked about how the war cost $120 to $130 billion. They talked about how they're getting $3.8 billion a year from the U.S. $30 billion of that was mostly in weapons for the war. And then they're talking about how they spent 80% of that money in the U.S. because they buy weapons from us, and then they also share intel with us and all of that stuff. He is really reiterating that this is a strong partnership between Israel and the U.S. But what he's talking about here is he's basically talking about how well their economy is doing. And if your economy is doing so well, then that naturally leads to the next question of, okay, if your economy is doing so well, why do you need so much money from us? And then is it the money that you're getting from us that is helping your economy to do well? Or are you able to sustain your economy on your own without the help of American taxpayer dollars? And so I think this is a good conversation, and they didn't really dig too much into what I just said, but that would have been a great pushback question for PBD to ask, especially if your economy is doing well, and that seems to indicate that you wouldn't need as much financial support from other countries in order to, one, take care of your people in your country, but then also to be able to defend yourself. And then he also later on in the interview brings up the 5 eyes. And so he's basically talking about how, again, this is a good relationship to have between Israel and the U.S. because they give us weapons that they make, and they also give us intel. And so he brings up this alliance of sharing security and intel. And this is an alliance between 5 countries: the United States, the United Kingdom, Canada, Australia, and New Zealand. And he says, hey, we're the 6th eye. Israel is part of this alliance. And so he's really hitting home, or trying to hit home, that Israel is involved in intel sharing, and they do things to help benefit or better other countries through the information that they have to justify why they get support from other countries in regards to defending themselves from people in the Middle East. And then there's another part of the conversation that comes up where they're talking about how Israel, yes, they get a lot of financial aid, but they are the ones who are doing all of the dirty work. They're the ones who are fighting. And they talk about how they're a fighting ally, and the U.S. doesn't have to put troops on the ground in order to help with this war. We really just have to send over money, send over weapons, and all of that stuff so that they can do the fighting themselves. He also hits home, hey, we're not just fighting for us, we're fighting for you too, because if we weren't standing in their way, they would just be coming for you guys because they chant death to America. And so he's really trying to drive home the narrative, hey, we are helping you guys too. Hamas, whatever, Iran, they have to come through us in order to get through you guys. And so you guys should want us to take up this fight, basically, because we are protecting you, because if they get past us, then you guys are actually going to have to put in the work to defend yourselves from these other countries who do not like Israel, or who do not like the U.S. as an extension of us and our partnership with Israel. And then the other thing that they get into is the idea that people in Israel can just call up America and say, hey, we want this done, do it or else. And then this really ties into the whole idea of AIPAC and how they are said to control Congress, control politicians in order to implement whatever agenda that they want implemented in the U.S. that helps benefit those in Israel. And so PBD counters this by saying, no, Trump wouldn't allow this, but he thinks that other people would allow Israel to be able to control America and American politicians and all of that stuff. And then this leads them into the conversation about Hamas and October 7th, and if this would have happened if Trump was in power, if Trump was the president. So we're going to play that clip.
He's a great leader.
So going back to that, I want to clarify this again. So you said you don't know whether Hamas October 7 attack would have happened under Trump. So you're saying Hamas would have had the audacity, even under Trump, to have attacked, or no, they would have feared him?
Probably not, but it's hard to say with these maniacs. You can't quite tell. I think Iran would have been more careful, and Iran is the patron. Would they have controlled completely their client, their proxy? Maybe not. Maybe they would have, possibly.
Okay, so here in this clip, he's really reiterating that Trump would not have been controlled. He really does what's best, what he thinks is best for the American people. And then he also says that I think this is where I was getting really confused. I believe he's saying that he does not think that Hamas would have attacked if Trump had been president, but he's also saying that he doesn't quite know what would have happened. But then he's saying that Iran would have been more careful in how they decided to move if Trump was president. And so I'm a little bit confused by that. I may have to listen to that a few more times to really figure out what he was saying. But the first time that he gave his answer, I was like, I don't know what you're saying. And so that was just really confusing for me. So if you guys know or have any insight on exactly what he's speaking about, let me know in the comment section below. And then I also really like how he talked about the relationship with Biden. He talked about basically how Biden supported us, and then he basically got to this point where he's like, hey, no more, or we're gonna slap an embargo on you and all of this stuff. And so he's talking about how I guess other people came to him and said, hey, Biden's serious about this, he's going to do this. And then he was like, hey, if you want to do that embargo, basically that's not going to stop us. We'll fight with our fingernails if we have to. And so he is really setting up this idea that they are really willing to fight even if they have no support or no weapons or anything like that. If everyone is against them, they really are trying to fight for their right to live. But I don't know if they've been to that point where they're not getting anything from the US at all and they truly have to fight on their own. So that is a interesting idea for him to bring up, that they are willing to fight on their own if they don't have any support and all of that stuff. But I don't know if they've ever truly been in that situation where it's just them and nothing else. They can't rely on anyone else. And so that is a interesting idea to think of. But what I think was kind of compelling with what he said was that basically Biden had a stop limit or a point that he was not willing to go past. And so that is interesting because it does give this impression that America doesn't completely and blindly agree with what you do. There are limits, there are things that we are willing to not support or things that we won't support. And so then he talked about how Trump came in, was a great American help and all of this stuff. And so who knows what the answer or the response will be when Trump reaches a point where he's saying, okay, hey, we're not going past this point and all of this stuff. So it does present this narrative that America does support Israel, but there are kind of, I guess, hard limits depending on who the president is, I guess. And so I thought that was just interesting for him to even bring that up, because that does create, and maybe this is the purpose of him bringing this up, but that does present the narrative that America doesn't just blindly support Israel. America has a mind of its own and all of that stuff. And so I don't know if you guys will think that that's true or not, but let me know what you guys think in the comment section. Okay, moving on, PBD does ask him about this joint press conference that they had, and basically this is the press conference a while back where Trump was basically talking about developing the Gaza Strip and turning it into, I guess, a opportunity for people to have jobs and just kind of take over that area and just make it something different. And so this is where a lot of people are kind of, I guess, grossed out, because we understand that there's a war happening, we understand that there's destruction, we understand that human lives are being lost, and they're talking about this as an opportunity, like a real estate deal, to just basically value the land over the lives that are being lost and the people who are sacrificing everything that they have to stay in those areas because they don't want to leave. And so just the idea of him talking about, hey, we can make money off of this, we can make it better and all of this stuff. And so PBD is asking him, like, hey, were you surprised by what Trump was saying? Because from your reaction, you look like you were caught off guard. And he doesn't actually answer the question, in my opinion. I felt like he was just going off on something else that may have been said just before that clip, but he wasn't directly responding to the clip that we saw on the screen. And I meant to go back and listen to like the full part of whatever Trump was saying to see if what Netanyahu said was actually the case of what he could have been reacting to. But in the clip that PBD showed, there didn't seem to be a relation between what Netanyahu said and then what Trump was saying. So basically what Netanyahu was saying, that he was reacting to the idea of giving Gazan people a way to leave since they were locked in. So they're talking about how they're surrounded by enemies, they can't leave, they're kind of stuck there. So the idea of give them a choice on if they want to leave and all of that stuff. And I think they don't want to leave, like that's their homeland, they don't want to be forced out and all of that stuff. And then Netanyahu says that basically Gaza exists as a base to attack Israel. It's meant for Israel's destruction. That's the only reason why it exists. And I don't know if the people in Gaza would agree with that, because they do see this as their rightful home and all of that stuff. They don't want to leave. And so they're being forced out and pushed out and all of that stuff. And so he's saying that the goal is to free Gazans from Hamas and just kind of make that like an area that's not ruled by terror. But I think other people are arguing that they just want to kind of expand their borders, and it's not really about protecting the people in Gaza, it's just about expanding Israel. And so then there comes the question of, well, okay, going back to what Trump said about Americans owning the Gaza Strip and developing it, would you be okay with that? And he says something about he's okay if the U.S., if Americans govern Gaza, but they don't raise or they don't allow the people in that area to kind of raise their kids to hate Israel or retaliate against Israel and all of that stuff. And so he says that he would be okay, I guess, if Americans own that area, if they developed it and all of that stuff. And so I guess we'll see what happens and how those words play out. But I did feel like he didn't address the question of what Trump was saying in the actual clip that was played, and he just kind of started talking about something else. And so I don't know if I'm reading that wrong, and you can let me know in the comment section below. Okay, moving on to Iran. So basically they're talking about Iran. They're talking about pre-1979 and post-1979. And basically there was a transition from a pro-Western monarchy to a Islamic republic. They're talking about how in Iran they are basically not taking care of their people. He's talking about some water crisis. And then he's also talking about a podcast that he did recently. I did not look that up to see what he was talking about, but he was saying that I think they got like 70 million views and then maybe 50 million were people in Iran. So I'm not sure about those numbers. That's something that I would have to look off when I'm done with this video. But he was basically saying that Iran is a threat. They're working on nuclear weapons. They have missiles that can reach the U.S. And so he's basically talking about how much they are a threat to Israel and then also to the U.S. And so this leads PBD into his next question about the Holocaust and the genocide. And he is really saying, hey, at this point, I'm probably the only one who cares about this. So this is a question for me. And he's really kind of, I guess, putting Netanyahu on the spot to acknowledge the Armenian genocide. And so he's saying, hey, Israel, the government, they haven't acknowledged this genocide. And then I think Netanyahu pushes back and says, well, we have. And then he's like, well, no, you, the prime minister yourself, have not done that. And then he's like, oh, okay, well, I just did. I'm doing it in this interview. And so there wasn't really that pushback or a deeper conversation. It was just like, okay, you said it. Cool, I'll accept that. And so I don't know how that will play over in terms of people who care about that particular issue. But again, it did just reflect the broader interview where basically Netanyahu gave his answers and then PBD either kind of reacted to it or affirmed whatever was said and then just moved on to the question. So there wasn't really a whole lot of room or opportunity for debate on what he actually said and to really hold his feet to the fire. Alrighty, so to wrap up this interview, I definitely learned a lot of new information in this interview that I did not have prior to watching this interview. And then also, I don't feel like the interview really changed anything for me in terms of how I see Israel or how I see Netanyahu. But I do think that based on all of the comments online, the interview says more about PBD than it does about Netanyahu. And so I'll be curious to see how Netanyahu's other appearances on podcasts go, if anybody is going to shift their strategy for the people who haven't had their episodes filmed yet or anything like that, if they're going to change their strategy based on all of the feedback and backlash that PBD is getting just from how he handled this interview. Are we going to see longer form interviews from Netanyahu and other podcasters? And also there's the controversy of even platforming someone like Netanyahu based on the people who do not like him, who think he's committing a genocide and think that he is just disregarding human lives in Gaza, all for protecting Israel and kind of like overstepping what he should be allowed to do as far as how he is responding to the attack on October 7th. Now, moving forward, in terms of PBD, I did see that he did a episode for the Jubilee Surrounded series that they do. So I do want to watch that and also react to that just because I did the one with Amanda Seales, and that was a good debate to watch just for the different reactions and kind of the different conversations that interview generated, that debate hate generated. So I do have that on my radar of things that I want to watch. But overall, I can definitely see where everyone's coming from in terms of this interview and not really liking how it was handled, because I really do think that this was just kind of like a traditional kind of press tour for like a book or a movie or that sort of thing. So there was really no opportunity to ask hard-hitting questions and to really make Netanyahu sweat and kind of earn any good PR from doing this interview. So yeah, let me know what you guys think about this interview in the comment section below. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.